The Extraordinary Case of the Umbrella Crime, the Trial Finale. The Trial. Salvador had been put in preventive jail as the investigation developed. The judge had set a bail that however neither he, in disability, nor his working-class parents could afford to pay. However, in an act of solidarity, dozens of locals pooled their money to bail him out of jail. And so, after a few weeks, Salvador was free for at least as long as the trial would last. His neighbors also pooled in more money to pay a good lawyer for him. He had initially requested a public attorney since that was his only realistic option given his scarce means. The trial for the death of Enrique Doval began in November 2002, 19 months after the fateful encounter. The accusation had requested a more exhaustive study of Enrique's injuries during the inquiry phase of the case, and they asked the judge for a year and a half in prison under manslaughter charges. In the second autopsy, the coroner determined that Enrique had actually been struck twice in that unusual manner. Meaning, at least one strike wasn't as accidental as the defense claimed. This report also made emphasis on the amount of force needed to break that bone barrier at the back of the nasal cavity. According to it, in the scenario related by Salvador, it'd be unlikely the tip of the umbrella could have broken through the bone. It'd certainly cause significant pain and bleeding, but it would have just pushed Enrique's head backward, leaving his brain unharmed. They argued that, in order to cause such injury, Salvador would have had to shove the umbrella tip into Enrique's nose as the bully laid down already unconscious on the ground, and therefore, his head would have no room behind to counter the pressure the tip exercised on the bone. Their allegation placed Salvador as someone who went beyond legitimate self-defense and, enraged by Enrique, stepped into deadly assault territory. However, they weren't able to explain how did Salvador, underweight and weakened by his cancer, supposedly knock the stockier and stronger Enrique out during the fight in the first place. In the meantime, dozens of neighbors attended the trial as witnesses. Every single one of them spoke about Enrique's antisocial ways and the extreme level of harassment and abuse he had subjected Salvador to. As for the latter, they attested Salvador had always been a responsible and polite young man that had always gone out of his way to avoid violence and de-escalate these situations. What is more, Enrique's family itself made witness statements in favor of Salvador, explaining to the judge and the popular jury that Enrique was a dangerous man who seemingly only understood violence. The defense, along with the locals, went a step further. They argued that they'd go all the way to requesting an official pardon from the government itself should Salvador be convicted of manslaughter. Finally, in April of 2003, 2 years after the altercation, the popular jury of 8 peers delivered their verdict. They all unanimously declared Salvador Lopez not guilty of the manslaughter charges for the death of Enrique Doval on April 23 of 2001. The defense prevailed. The attack from Enrique had placed Salvador in what Spanish criminal law calls a situation of insurmountable fear, in which Salvador was psychologically unable to respond in such a way to consider less lethal ways to defend himself due to the significant risk to his life Enrique's aggression amounted to. Aftermath. Salvador Lopez Timiraos was acquitted free of all charges. In his last statements to the press he said he just wanted to be left alone, and hopefully get a job as soon as his cancer went into remission. Speaking of their support for Salvador, some of Cusadero's neighbors admitted later on that they had gone out of their way to paint a horrible picture of Enrique and that in reality, while he was a dangerous, violent bully, Enrique was not as bad as they reflected on the trial. But they alleged that at the time their priority was to avoid Salvador's life being ruined due to something they felt he had no fault in. In 2021 the owner of the tavern told the press they no longer speak ill of Enrique, no point in it. We already saved Salvador. Enrique can rest in peace now, he said. Salvador Lopez is currently 43 years old and lives in Cusadero. He's been cancer-free for almost 20 years.